On Thursday, we heard that the UK economy had contracted slightly in May, with GDP falling by 0.1%. Now, this is the latest in a stream of bad headlines for the UK economy. So in this video, instead of taking a look at yet another individual piece of bad news, we thought we'd take a look at the deeper structural reasons why the UK economy seems to be stuck in a sort of perma-crisis, and whether it'll ever get out of it. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So before we get into it, two caveats. Firstly, the UK's economic woes are often overstated. Fundamentally, the UK is a wealthy, developed country with high standards of living by international standards. Nonetheless, the rest of the world is clearly catching up, and the UK is also lagging behind its economic peers at the moment. So we thought this video was still justified. Secondly, this isn't intended as an exhaustive list. We're going to look at 3 reasons for the UK's economic perma-crisis in this video: the productivity puzzle, the housing crisis, and the political stasis caused by Brexit. But obviously there are a million other things you could point to which would help to explain the UK's current economic woes. But we can't fit all of that into an 8-minute video. Regardless then, let's start with productivity. Productivity measures economic output per hour of work, and it's maybe the most important metric in all of economics. Without increasing productivity, GDP can only grow by making people work more or by bringing more people into a country. Which is why Paul Krugman once said that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. Anyway, the UK's so-called productivity puzzle refers to the fact that since the financial crisis of 2008, UK productivity has essentially flatlined. Now, to be fair, productivity growth was already on the decline before the crisis. But if the pre-2007 trend had continued, productivity would now be 16% higher than it actually is, which would mean way higher living standards. Now, the UK isn't alone here, and many other countries, especially in Europe, also saw a slowdown in their productivity after 2008. But the UK has been particularly badly affected. France and Germany, for example, have been able to maintain relatively steady productivity growth since the crisis. Although that might be partly because they had lower productivity growth in the UK going into the crisis in the early 2000s. Anyway, the causes for this are disputed, but stagnant productivity is one of the main reasons the UK has found it so difficult to achieve sustained growth in the past few years. And it's also one of the reasons why wages have essentially stagnated since the crash. On to the second reason though, housing. We've talked about the housing crisis in more detail in previous videos, so go and take a look at those if you want to know more. But the TLDR is that houses are just too expensive in the UK. Historically, the ratio between the median house price and the median income sat at around 4, which means that the median house used to cost 4 times more than the median annual salary. Today, however, the average house costs 9 times the average salary in the UK, and over 12 times the average salary in London. Now, this is obviously bad news for aspiring homeowners or anyone stuck in the UK's miserable private rental market. But some people also argue that it has further reaching effects on the entire economy. This housing theory of everything basically says that expensive housing is responsible for all of our other economic woes. Take the productivity puzzle we talked about a moment ago. One of the reasons that productivity is so low is because people can't afford to move to high productivity places with high productivity jobs. London, for example, has a productivity rate 32% higher than the national average. Now, that's in part because the most productive workers work in London, but it's also because it's easier to be productive if you do work in London. There are greater network effects, better infrastructure, better services, and if more people were able to work in London, then the UK's aggregate productivity would substantially increase. Unfortunately though, they're not, because housing in London is unaffordably expensive even when you take into account the higher wages. High house prices also reduce consumer spending, because everyone's spending all of their money on bricks and mortar, which means less economic activity and exacerbates inequality. That's because high house prices advantage people who already have money, because they can put a deposit down on a house and benefit from the rising prices, while forcing poorer people further into the private rental market, which transfers even more wealth to landlords and property owners. Housing even partially explains the modern world's demographic crisis. As we explained in recent videos over on the TLDR Global channel, across most of the developed world, including the UK, fertility rates, that is the number of children per woman, have fallen well below the replacement rate of 2.1. This is a real headache for governments, because low fertility rates mean smaller populations, and perhaps more importantly, an aging population, which puts a real burden on public services. Proponents of the housing theory of everything argue that this is, at least in part, because expensive housing means that even if you want to have kids, if an extra bedroom would cost you hundreds of thousands of pounds, you just can't afford it. Anyway, you get the idea. The housing crisis doesn't just affect housing. It's a structural drag on the UK economy in numerous other ways too. The final reason for the UK's long-standing economic woes, though, is Brexit. But not for the reason you might think. Obviously, the data suggests that Brexit itself has had a negative impact on the UK economy. Analysis by the Centre for European Reform, for example, estimates that the UK's GDP is nearly 5% lower than it would have been. And Brexit-induced uncertainty has probably also limited productivity growth by discouraging business investment. However, perhaps most importantly, Brexit has also prevented the UK's political class from sorting out its pre-existing crises. Both the productivity crisis and the housing crisis have been around for a while now, and policymakers do know that they need to sort them out. But for the past 7 years or so, most civil servants and MPs have been preoccupied by the question of Brexit, which means that there's little bandwidth left to sort out the other problems beleaguering the UK economy. The point we're making is that while there is a direct cost to Brexit, there's also an opportunity cost. All of that effort spent sorting out Brexit could otherwise have been spent sorting out other structural problems afflicting the UK economy. So those are 3 of the reasons why the UK economy is in a state of permanent crisis: the productivity puzzle, the housing crisis, and Brexit. If you want more updates on this story and others, then be sure to check out our show, The Daily Briefing. Now, we obviously discuss a whole load of news across the TLDR network, but The Daily Briefing is your quick update, getting you up to speed on the world's biggest political issues in just a matter of minutes. Now, a bunch of other news organizations obviously do these kinds of daily summaries, but coming from TLDR, you know that it has our normal, unbiased, explanatory, and only semi-serious tone. So if you want to feel fully tuned in, check out The Daily Briefing. You can watch on YouTube or Nebula just by searching for the TLDR Daily Briefing, or you can listen by searching for us in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for your support.